You raised up when we were emailing with each other the song "Praise," which I think I actually knew the song,
Of course you
um,
do. It's huge.
and the the lines, the imprecatory lines that are alluded to,
Alluded.
it's even very light the way it's put. And so this question was like, can you really do imprecatory psalms today? To wit, I will
Yeah.
inject this in this podcast, Boney M's version of By the Rivers of Babylon, Psalm 137, the most imprecatory of the imprecatory psalms,
They
was
don't
made in.
say the baby's dashing,
They
though,
do
do
not
they?
say the babies part, but if you
Okay.
like,
Okay.
if you go looking for the lyrics to this song, you're going to run into the babies part, right?
Oh,
So,
Lord.
but it was a 1980s hit, right, by Boney
Hit.
M, By the Rivers, and it's a very catchy way to
It's a
put it
nice song.
too. By an Aruban band, apparently we found out living in West Germany. So,
What a
so it's not
pedigree.
like imprecatory psalms can't find their place. I'll also note our podcast with Trevor Lawrence on his book on imprecations. He's brilliant on this topic. That actually there's a really good role for imprecation in Christian life. He teases that out all kinds of interesting ways. But what was the controversy with praise and this particular song? And like, what's your hot take on it or cold take? Because you're an expert. So
Well, I mean, I've led the song dozens of times myself and been around it many times. And it's a song that it was one of these kind of, 8 author songs. I can't remember. It was a lot. It's a well-crafted song that kind of came popularized through Elevation Church a couple of years ago. I'm just amazed that you could have a song called Praise and have it be, when you go to YouTube and put in
right,
the word praise,
right,
this song comes at the top. You're like, that is bold. It'd be like, I'm going to translate this and call it Bible. I'm just going to call it Bible and
right.
see what happens. It's like, it's probably going to be, Amazon's
Yeah,
going to find that a
no,
nightmare. But
that's
anyway,
true.
it worked well for them.
That's some SEO magic right there.
So, huge song. It's very energetic. White people love to try to clap along to it, but it also has a bit of a beat to it. So it's nice. It's got a nice kind of like multicultural flair to it as well. The bridge, one of the lines in the second verse maybe says
A
praise
very
is the.
big building bridge.
It actually it's not quite the same though. It's because it's not passionate. It's a clip. It's a song that comes at a clip, so you got a
Yeah,
nice
yeah,
kind of energy to it. The line is praise is the water my enemies drown in. And it's sung quite happily, right? Like at the end of the day, it sounds like it's a good thing. But it's so. As you mentioned, this is, I mean, you could say it's kind of psalmic. I mean, to me, it sounds much more Exodus 15, like Song of Moses-y.
Right.
Nonetheless, it's definitely imprecatory, I guess, because it's not even saying, I guess when I think of imprecation, I think of like, hey, God, do this. Whereas this is kind of like more, and this is a subtle twist on it. It's kind of more like, when I praise, this happens, which is also like embedded in here is a whole host of theologies around what worship is and what it's intended to do, which we'll truncate and leave off to the side. So the idea is that a lot of people are like, you singing about drowning your enemies is kind of harsh, baby. Like that doesn't sound super Jesus-y to me. How does this work? Which of course is a bit of a narrow
Right. It's like, have you read
understanding.
Jesus? You should go back and read the red letters again.
Yeah, he's got some harsh words that he says. But nonetheless, a really brilliant writer, somebody named Kelsey Kramer McGinnis wrote an article for CT. Maybe you can link it in the show notes. I don't know. It's very interesting and kind of the talk about it because it was about context. In other words, it was like in this day and age here in North America when people are at loggerheads with each other and everyone is everyone else's enemy, is it really wise to talk about enemies drowning in the waters of our praise? When especially there's guys like, I don't know if I should name names, but worship leaders who are traveling across the country and essentially saying that praise is the kind of thing that will drown out our political opponents and whatnot. And so,
Wow.
like in other words, if you politicize in this highly politicized and just kind of like demagogic scenario, is it good? This context. And so to your, maybe the point that you're bringing in earlier, at some point you have to sing the psalm because it just happens to be on the roster for this weekend, right? Like it's on the set list. It's just what happens. Now we're singing the stuff about enemies. Like it's, and so to what degree does context, both kind of local and then also kind of textual, really matter? Or like, should we say, because you alluded to the fact you're a pastor, like pastorally, do we say, yes, this is true, like this is theologically true, but Jesus is both grace and truth. And so is this more of a grace season where we kind of gotta go in the interest of other people? Should we dampen this theme and not allow it to kind of creep to the surface as much as possible? So I guess I actually empathize with what people are saying when they make that argument, but mostly I think it's kind of snowflakey a little bit, or where people are just saying like, maybe you don't understand that, like actually the person who wrote the article mentions this. It's like, I'm well aware of the idea that in Ephesians, Paul says we wrestle not against flesh and blood. And so like, I know that there is a really theologically robust reason to sing these words. The problem is, does your congregation know that? What are they picturing in their heads when they sing these songs? Now, here's the thing that only a seasoned worship leader will really know. You never know what they're thinking about.
Right.
You actually can't control how they're contextualizing any song that you sing.
Or any word in your sermon.
That's right.
Any illustration, yeah.
So you have to give it to God in some respects when it comes to that.
Yeah, in some ways, the easy move is take it out of the set list, right? If it's going to cause too many problems. The harder one, we did a series on art, and when people were tearing down all the statues, and I had this big question, like, should Christians ever make art about anybody ever, or is that already like forbidden in Scripture? And which was a genuine question of mine. But one of the things that came back with the issue of art is rather than tear it down, surround it with frame it, literally surround statues with a wall that actually frames what's going on here. The same thing with worship music, as you say, keep it on the list, but say, hey, we're going to hit this line. And just so you know, this is the context, right? And use it as a teaching moment. But it just strikes me also that how difficult it is. I mean, just because it happens to be a sensitivity, but really any kind of the truisms that you put in praise and worship music are all theologically controversial. I mean, this is one of the, so when I'm reading the lyrics on the screen, I'm just like, oh, no, I can't go there. Like,
well, I mean, so often people say like, we shouldn't sing about blood. This is something I hear all the time. We shouldn't sing songs about blood. Matt Redman has lots of beautiful songs about the blood.
Yeah.
And so we shouldn't do that because that's super weird. And you know what? Point made. You're 100% right. Totally weird. If you walked into a place and they were singing about blood, you'd be like, well, I guess I probably should go. But the problem is that's a controlling metaphor throughout the entirety, not just the Old, but the New Testament, right? Like,
and then later in the service, you're actually going to be drinking symbolically cannibalistic, blood.
If you're an Anglican, you are, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So it's like you can't do away with all of it, nor can you explain all of it, because that's just pedantry writ wild. So you end up kind of in a bit of a holding pattern where you go, well, what choices should we make to kind of mitigate just the current realities that we have, I guess. But
yeah, no, it's just the difficulty of translating, and and I think that is one difference. You said, well, how can I tell the difference between things that sound theologically more like the Psalms to me and less like, and I would say actually that's probably one of them, is the kind of truistic leaning of a lot of worship music, rather than, Psalms often go hyper specific. When we stood by the rivers on this day, and you did the reviews of history are, town names, people names, place names, versus this kind of hyperbolic, you're the greatest ever, you're the most wonderful, which both of those are found in the Psalms.
True,
but the specifics, I think, are less likely to show up in modern worship music. And maybe that's changing. I don't know. I've heard some great worship songs that I thought they pulled off what the Psalms are doing. So
yeah, it's interesting. We lead a song here at our university, which I haven't led elsewhere, but I think it's called Alabaster Jar. So it's a beautiful song about, pouring out your worship in front of Jesus, kind of emotional, romantic. Some dudes might not be into it, but it's interesting is then I asked a couple of worship leaders, I was like, do you know what the alabaster jar is referring to? And these people who are leading the songs, and they said, I do not. And so this is one of the things that's interesting about specificity is actually So you could hear that as an indictment about biblical literacy, and
Right,
don't hear that. This school is wonderful. They're reading the Bible, I promise. The actual thing is more. I'm kind of coming to your defense in some respects to say that specificity often translates itself sometimes. So people talk about like being worried about like if you're too specific, it will hyper pigeonhole the context, and you won't be able to use it everywhere. Which is of course what we really want for mass worship songs, is for them to be able to be led in Idaho and everywhere else. I don't know, Idaho and Hawaii and all the places. Right? And so like, well, let's make it generic. But if you actually make something kind of brilliantly specific,
Yes.
that specificity actually transcends. And as a songwriter myself, I haven't written a lot of worship songs, but I was a songwriter, a bad songwriter for pop songs. And I was always like, country songs always annoyed me because they were always so kind of specific, all the details. And I was like, but as I've gotten older, I go, oh, that's actually the brilliance, is that even though I've never owned this color truck or I've never dated a girl with that name, it doesn't matter. I still get it because they were specific. Yeah.
Yeah, this is, there's actually a great New York Times podcast maybe on Taylor Swift lyrics and how she's just kind of a brilliant writer of specifics that somehow become universal. I would argue every Elton John song ever written is hyper specific. You don't even know what he's talking about. Hunting the horny-backed toad, you're like, but somehow it feels so present and relevant to everything you're doing. So yeah. I guess that's a whole other episode. We could talk about the lyricality of the Psalms, right?
Yeah.
Well, Marc, I'm going to say it wrong. Jolicoeur.
Très bien, très bien.
Okay. Thank you very much for your wisdom and your time and your thinking on this matter.
My pleasure, Drew. Thanks for having me.